Hello, I'm Steve. I'm a full stack developer at Elliptic, and normally I spend my time making pretty UIs. I'd say my number one concern at work at the moment is making sure that my component library is extensible enough and it's accessible from all the different products that we offer. So I'm the UI guy at my company. I'm definitely our expert in React, and I'm generally the go-to person when someone has a CSS problem or they want to talk about a new feature. I only really pick up server-side tickets when there's a capacity problem or when I want to dip my hand into the water and hear about what new problems there are in the API, and really just to keep myself clued up so I know what people are talking about during the backlog grooming sessions. I'm a non-computer science graduate. For definitely my first few years of my career, I really struggled with this. I felt that everyone else had loads of innate knowledge, which was just like absolutely beyond me. I grew up on Windows. I love a graphical user interface. I stay away from Bash and command line as much as possible. And finally, I don't know any Kates. I think when I first started going on call, this joke probably would have gone a little bit over my head. Kubernetes is often abbreviated to K8. And I think for the first couple of times I saw that, I was just like, I have no idea what they're on about. But my point is that I don't work with containers that often. Generally, my experience with Docker is running around end-to-end tests and doing like Docker compose up. So I don't really seem like the ideal candidate for someone doing their first talk about going on call. So how did I get here? Well, about 6 months ago, an email went out. Our company was desperate for on-callers. People were coming off the rota and we needed new people to go on. And at the company, then the current on-callers were those like really hardcore like back-end developers that just basically like live in Bash and eat Terraform for breakfast, and the most experienced DevOps engineers. And so initially, I didn't think that I should respond to the call out. But I spoke to my manager, I spoke to a couple of other people, and they all said that going on call is a great experience. It really broadens your mindset and you will learn tons of new stuff. So I did it. And after what felt like reading hundreds of knowledge base articles and a dummy's guide to Kubernetes, I was ready for my first shift. And everything was going so smoothly until the second day. Now, there's a whole separate story about how a kitten was found in my partner's parents' village, and I was getting a message saying, do you want a cat? Do you want to give this kitten a home? And I was rushing up to Northamptonshire to go collect said kitten. But anyway, we're in Pets at Home, like going aisle to aisle, like literally buying one of absolutely everything that we could possibly need. And that was the first time that my pager decided to go off. So I apologized to my partner and her mother and ran out to my car to go set up my mobile office. And working on these live instances, it isn't like how I normally work. Normally I work on local hosts, I'm the only person who can see it. It just runs on my local machine. If I break something, it's not going to matter. But in this instance, there's something wrong with our site. All of our customers are all trying to load up our app. And worst case, they might see nothing, or they might just see a load of 500s. And being the on-caller, it's my job to fix it. And we also have SLAs. Like if we're down for too much time, we have to start giving refunds to our customers. And it's on you to fix it. But being a developer and loving those kind of like lateral problem solving exercises, I dived into it and started looking at the logs, seeing what was going on. And in this case, it was a false alarm. It was just a blip of memory on one of our SQL databases. But I was hooked. And since then, I've been on call 4 or 5 times, including a fairly bleak, sober Christmas Eve. But I don't regret it at all. I don't regret it because I think most of my experience boils down to knowing how things break gives you a better understanding of how they work and why they're structured that way. I think my key learnings from being on call is, first, there's an obvious one of it's taught me how to build scalable products. And I'm not sure if I'm guilty of saying this first quote, but I'm definitely guilty of thinking it, of why don't we just use HTTP for everything? It'll make our lives on the server so much easier. You know, our diagrams would be so much simpler, and we would use consistent form of messaging throughout our apps. And after being on call and seeing the pain points of scaling our applications, I now realize that there's good reasons for doing this. We use messaging queues to protect our load-intensive microservices. And from this, it's kind of opened up my eyes to like the wider world of architecture, which I think is particularly important at the moment, as there's the great migration of everything going into AWS so we can all hand Amazon loads of money. And there's these new architecture patterns, things like lambdas and streams, where you can scale the number of lambdas that you have in relation to the intensity of your stream. It's also taught me some really interesting lessons about the roles and responsibility of the other people in my company. I'm definitely not an expert in anything that they do, but I know how it works. I know how my job as a front ender fits into what they do. And going forward, I can collaborate more with them. Tech leadership is something which I've got my eye on and something that I've been working towards. And getting this kind of more well-rounded T-shaped developer has definitely helped me learn some important lessons. And secondly, I've learned how to build better products due to this. We've all been there. We've all been working on the API. We've looked at the code. We've looked at what can happen and be like, cool. Oh, sorry. We've all been working on a UI before. We've looked at the different error cases. We've come up with the different error types that we need. It's like, do we really need to handle that one? Do we need a catch-all error on this place? And from being on call, I've learned that the answer is generally yes. Yes, you do need that. Things on the server break in weird and mysterious ways. You definitely can't predict everything that could possibly go wrong. And there's nothing quite teaches you this lesson, like being woken up at 3 in the morning to start trawling through logs to work out what's broken, why it's broken, and how you're going to fix it. I've also learned a more holistic lesson on this, and this is about my job and how I fit into the wider team. As a developer, I'm not just paid to write code. Like, I don't get paid for the number of lines of code I write, or I get docked pay for the number of bugs that I introduce. Instead, my job as a developer is to build a solution that customers want and customers are going to pay money for. And I used to think that the way to do this is just by creating incredible UIs, sorting out those user experience journeys. And instead, I've now realized that performance and reliability are a big part of this as well. It's never going to be a good user experience if pages take 30 seconds to load. And it's never going to be, you're never going to have a loved product if it's only there when customers want it 50% of the time. And our job is to work as a team to build these things and not to work in silos. And then finally, and potentially most importantly, I've learned how to deal with the imposter inside of me. Imposter syndrome is a massive problem in our industry. There's always more to learn. And at the start of my talk, I actually did myself a massive disservice. I spent so long speaking about all the things that I didn't know, all those elements which are just unknowns to me. Whereas I should have been evaluating myself by all the experience that I do have, all the things that I can do. So you know more than you think you know. And finally, being on call or being a company that has on-callers is important if companies want to offer reliable services. And so your company will either mandate that everyone is on call, where they have an obligation to make sure that you have the tools and the skills that you need to help out when something breaks, or they're going to be asked for volunteers. And if they're asking for volunteers, again, it's in their own benefit to make sure that you are equipped to deal with this. And it's a learning experience. You will learn a lot. And again, your company is invested in you, and they benefit if you become a better developer, because you will help them build better products. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about my experiences or any doubts about that they have from signing up to go on call?
There is a question in the chat, Steve. Do you have any ritual for dealing with the imposter syndrome?
Rituals for dealing with imposter syndrome. It's a very difficult thing to deal with. I think everyone has their own different ways of things that work for them. Definitely for me, the first thing that I always think about is, at the end of the day, I'm a person. There's so much to learn in development. No one can learn everything. And when I was comparing myself to those hardcore back-end developers, then actually they're specialized. That's what they do. I'm also specialized in what I do, which doesn't necessarily help me out being an on-caller, but it's on them to make sure that the resources to fix these issues are publicly available. I won't ever be able to fix them as quickly as they do. And that's okay, because we're on different career paths, and I need to be looking at my own strengths rather than comparing my weaknesses to other people's strengths.
Oh, thank you. Good. We have another question. Were there any useful resources that your company provided to help with the initial leap on going on call?
Specifically for a new on-caller, there wasn't anything. What we do have is a good culture of writing up things that break or new products. Part of the go live process is to write about what happens if it breaks, what errors might you see, and what to do. And my steps to be on caller first was just like go through, make sure I could navigate it quickly. I obviously can't remember everything in there, but what's important is in a high pressure scenario, I can go in there and quickly find the correct pieces of information.
Good. And were you, now it's a question from me, were you in your first time, you know, it's a different experience from what you said. So did you have, were there more people on call that you could maybe send a message, maybe call, and, you know, if you had questions, if you didn't know how to deal, were there other people there to support you?
Yeah, so we actually go on call it in pairs, which is particularly useful like the first few times, because I was lucky. I got paired up with the head of DevOps for my first shift. So that was just definitely like a big relief. But in the case that I spoke about, I actually got there about 5 minutes before he did, and managed to diagnose the problems myself, which was definitely like a big ego boost to me.
Cool, great.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. So we have another comment in the chat, but I'm going to ask you, Steve, to have a look and see if it's a question, if you can engage more, because I'd like now you, Steve, stop sharing, please, because I'd like to pass the baton to Carly. Carly, sorry.
Cool. Do it.
I'm not good with pronunciation of some names. It's Carly.
No worries, it's cool.
Cool. So when you are ready, you can start sharing.
Cool. I'm hoping people can see my slides and obviously comment on the fact the background is the same.
Yes.
So hello everyone, and nice to see some familiar faces on the chat today. So hi, and thank you everyone for joining. So today I want to talk to you about what I consider to be an ultimate mashup, a combination of things that just work well together that you might not have originally considered. And this combination within the technical domain is combining end-to-end testing with behavior-driven development, behavioral specifications. So I'll walk you through why I think these things are complementary and how they highlight the user perspective in your tests. I'll reinforce that with an example showing kind of pre and post addition of behavior-driven development specifications. And I'll discuss some best practices based on some lessons that me and my team have encountered over the past year as we built them out. And then I'll leave, similar to Steve, a portion of time at the end for any questions that pop up as we go along. So before all of that, let me introduce myself. There we go. So my name is Carly Richmond. I am a senior software engineer at Morgan Stanley. I've worked there for 9 years. I actually joined straight out university and then never left, strangely enough. And when I'm not building financial products, I am a passionate technologist. So you'll see me posting things about agility, UI, UX, and just general, useful things on Twitter, Medium, and also my own personal blog. And then in my spare time, when I'm not doing those things, I love photography, cooking, and as many in the LGC know, is an ongoing joke. Avid tea drinker, hence why I've got, although the background's hiding it, this big, massive mug of tea. So before we start talking about each of these technical concepts and examples and all that nitty-gritty stuff, I want to share what inspired the title and why I'm calling this a mashup. So for those who are unfamiliar with this term, a mashup in music is when you take two tracks that you think might not necessarily blend together and combine them in hopes of, producing something a little catchier. And that's exactly what Ben Howell did last year. So last year he combined Dua Lipa's Hallucinate with the BBC News theme. It went down quite well on social media, which is where I managed to catch it. And it actually won Remix of the Year at the BBC Radio 1 Lockdown Awards as well. So as technologists, I want us to take a leaf out of Ben Howell's book as a musician and try and think about combining different practices together to help us build better products, even if they initially don't seem to match. And as you'll come to see, that's exactly why I justify combining these specifications elicited through behavior-driven development with end-to-end testing. So for those who are unfamiliar, end-to-end testing, or E2e, as you'll see in loads of documentation, refers to the ability to test the end user workflow by recreating the product experience from the user perspective. So you're actually testing the entire product from the beginning to the end as the user sees it. And that's a very important distinction to make, because often when I speak to people, they think about end-to-end in terms of the layers of the application. So going from your front end all the way through your middle team layers and back to your infrastructure. But that's not the element that's important. It can be useful, as you'll come to see later, at particular points. But when we think of end-to-end testing, it's the user perspective that we want to really highlight. So I want to walk you through an example of how basic end-to-end tests normally work, and hopefully show you why I think there's a couple of problems with this approach. So tech stack wise, I'm using Angular and Protractor because those are technologies I'm familiar with. However, there are various modes of other ones that you can, frameworks that you can use. Obviously, it's web dev, there's loads out there. So it's also worth noting that you might want to use Cypress, for example, instead of Protractor. I have several people I know that use that instead. But I've used it for my own kind of purposes of, being experienced, and I will call out anything that's Protractor specific, but it's worth noting that a lot of these kind of concepts will be familiar and should be applied irrespective of which framework you're using. So let's talk about where the code lives to start with in terms of folder structure. So generally with a new project, when we generate it, we're going to get our initial space. So you'll see the normal source and app directories, and then underneath we'll normally structure things in a component-based style to try and help break it into smaller pieces. However, when we're using end-to-end testing, this new e2e folder appears. And underneath that, we don't mandate the same structure. And within it, we've got two files of interest. So firstly, you've got your e2e spec, which is the actual test code. So that's where your tests are going to live. And then you've got the page object. Now, this is a Protractor specific pattern. I'm aware that Cypress does not advocate this, but as you'll come to see, it's basically where the logic is for pulling out, elements of your page in order to facilitate their assertions and validation within, the test of interest. So if we dive into the spec file, which is our main test point, for those who are familiar with Jasmine or maybe some other testing frameworks, you'll see it looks very similar to a unit test structure. We've got our describe in here, and that showcases an entire suite. And then underneath that, you'll see we've got it, which is basically an individual test. So this would represent a particular element of the workflow going through, or potentially you'll have another one for success and error states. Now, I only have one for simplicity, but if you think about an enterprise application or another app that perhaps you guys yourselves might be working on as part of your day jobs, you're going to see more than one of these within your spec. And then we've also got within our test, I'm basically utilizing the page object, which we'll show you in a minute where that comes from, getting my page, and then I'm performing a simple assertion against an element, in this case my title, to make sure that it's the required result. So I said I would tell you where the page comes from, and that's where this page object pattern for Protractor comes in. This is segregated from your test logic. So within here, I've got my page object that I'm calling, and then within it, I've also got several methods I want to call your attention to. So Protractor exposes the browser object firstly, which we use for basic things like browser operations, navigating pages, all those exciting things. And then we've also got this notion of elements that we're finding on a page. Protractor is a very element structured framework. So you'll see here what I've got is that I'm returning an element by a CSS path. I'll discuss some of the other options later. And I'm pulling out the title and simply getting the text, which I then compare in my tests. So for many of you who are maybe used to web development practices, you would have probably been quite comfortable with me walking through those things. However, one thing that I clearly notice is for a set of tests that are meant to outline the user perspective of how the app is intending to work, it's not very clear what that workflow is. I'm pretty sure if I put it across to certain audiences, such as maybe new developers, users, or other stakeholders, or even maybe a couple of people on the call today who are not from a web background, that's going to be absolute gobbledygook. And that can also introduce additional challenges even for those who are aware. So for example, if you're working on a larger enterprise application, or your application's now trying to scale up with loads of different features very quickly, that structure is not going to help you. It's going to get very difficult to try and document that workflow. But there is a way to make this better. And for me, that is to use behavioral specifications generated as a result of behavior-driven development practices. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, BDD, as we call it, or behavior-driven development, is a practice which evolved from the test-driven development movement. And it's where new features are discovered by collaborating with business partners directly and specifying them as a set of examples, which you can then use to drive your implementation and testing of your features. And it's quite an interesting thing because we have this very common language mistake that we make within my team, but I've also seen is now apparent outside as well, where people talk about BDDs referring to those examples. And I want to call out that I'm using the term behavioural specifications for a very particular reason, because BDD is the process by which you elicit them. If anyone wants to hear more about this kind of vernacular and all of the terms, I do suggest you go and check out a guy called Seb Rose. He's got a lot of useful resources to help you with understanding behaviour-driven development as an advocate, but also talk about the different kind of behavioural specifications and different practices that you might want to employ as part of BDD. So I said that this was a mashup and they worked well together. The reason for me is that these behavioural specifications, if you think about it, are actually examples that expose the view of the product from a user standpoint to us and ultimately helps us walk in our user's shoes. And this perspective then, as you'll come to see, can be documented in a common format to use in your tests, making it understandable not just for developers, but also for stakeholders too. And it also allows for a precise way, not just to specifying logic, because commonly what I've found is we tend to use these behavioural scenarios in server-side integration tests, but we can use them as part of front-end workflows too. So let me go back to that example again and show you how we can add a behavioural-driven development framework in there. So I've still got Angular and Protractor, those guys haven't went away. But the one thing that is here is I've added Cypress in as well. So not Cypress, sorry, that is not right. It's Cucumber. Getting confused with the C's today. So we're using Cucumber here. But obviously, if you do use Cypress, like Steve does, Cucumber does integrate well with that too. So let me revisit that folder structure again. So obviously make assumption that the source element that I showed you before is still going to be there. However, under end-to-end, in order to get this to scale, you really need to think about folder structure. So the way that we do it is typically we have a folder for features. And by features, I mean those example specifications that I was talking about before. You've got your steps, which you'll come to see are basically the code that drives every given line in a scenario within a feature file. And then I've still got my page object because, you know what, we're still using Protractor, so that pattern doesn't go away. So I'm hoping now that you see this, that you'll agree with me that using the Gherkin format outlined here as part of Cucumber better exposes the user perspective. So here is the main kind of entry point that you specify how your test workflow is going to function. So I've got a feature which represents basically, well, a feature in your app. And underneath that, you're going to have multiple scenarios in an ideal world, which are going to showcase an individual kind of workflow state. And underneath here, there's a few items in the scenario I want to call your attention to. So I've got the given line, and the purpose of that is to basically set up an individual scenario. I've got when, which is the action that a user is going to perform. And it's okay to have more than one when to try and chain actions together if that's what's expected in terms of the workflow state. We've also got then, and that's basically the asserting of a particular validation to make sure that you're passing a particular result and it's basically doing what you expect it to do. And there's a great flexibility in Cucumber because not only can you pass variables, as I have here with the title, but you can also pass in data tables. Now, working on financial products, I'm a little bit biased. We use a lot of data tables, but even for very simple applications, they can showcase collections very well. So don't dismiss them for other application types as well. So here is the steps file, which I mentioned to you before. It effectively replaces that spec that I showed you before. And it's the glue that basically provides executable steps in accordance with that feature. So you'll see our given, when, and then keywords. They're still here, they haven't gone anywhere. Cucumber exposes these calls where we can basically map them to a given string. So in this case, with my given, I can map it to the home page. So given I on the home page, you would have spotted in the feature. And then we connect that to an asynchronous function, which does whatever we need it to do. We've also got these setup functions that it gives us. So you're able to set up things that are common to every scenario. And the before allows you to do that. So anything executed within the before will happen before each individual scenario is executed. And although I've not depicted it here, there's also an after if you want to do any kind of teardown logic after each individual scenario. So you'll see in here, we're actually resetting the app page every time. And next, I want to call attention to the fact that we're still using the page object to try and get our results within a given then statement. But the way that we're connecting it for reuse is that we're utilizing variables. So you'll see the braces syntax here, where I'm saying to Cucumber, this is basically going to be the value for the title that I want to assert to. And then you pass that into the function so that you can pull apart and inspect whatever you would like to inspect, assert what you'd like to assert. And then, again, I'm working on financial applications, have to call out the data table again. So Cucumber exposes the table definition object, and I've used rows here. But you can also use the hashes functions that it provides to pull out those results from the feature, and then you can perform whatever assertions you like against it. And then the page object file doesn't change. We're still using Protractor. So I want to call your attention to a couple of other useful extensions to make sure that you realize that it's not just CSS that we want to do everything by. So firstly, still getting the page using the browser object. That's not changed. But still getting the header. That's not changed either. But here I need to get my artist for asserting against that data table. And the way that I've done this here is I've used the $$ shorthand syntax. So with the element entry above, it doesn't have to be CSS. You can specify XPath expressions, you can specify ID, other attributes from HTML objects, and you can also, because this is Protractor and therefore, Angular specific, you can also have things like ng model if you're from that particular world. But here I've used $$ because I'm happy using the CSS shorthand, and I want to get multiple elements back in order to assert against that collection. And for those of you that are curious, because I put it in the import on the top, there is a single $ as well. So if you're wanting to kind of have a consistency in terms of using the $ syntax over the element and element finder syntax, you can do that as well. So as a team, we've been using end-to-end tests combined with these specifications for around about a year now. And obviously, you've seen from that example that we showcase the user perspective, and that's been a great opportunity for us. But we've also learned a few lessons along the way on how to maybe not structure or use these tests. And we've also done some things right too. So what I would like to do now is to call out some best practices for those of you who either are looking at indoctrinating end-to-end testing and behavioral specifications into your own practice, or for those that are just curious as to what went wrong and went right. So the first thing I want you to have a think about is your folder structure. I was very particular earlier when I talked about the fact that we have a folder for features, a folder for pages, and a folder for your steps. And the reason I was that because you've introduced an additional file type, it's very easy to get to a point where these tests will not scale for you, particularly in enterprise applications, large monorepos, or even if you're working on a tool that is going to be scaling up very quickly in the not so distant future. We decided on that particular structure through a combination of reading and realizing that mimicking the same structure that we have in terms of our application, in terms of those components, was not going to work, because when we're talking about a user workflow, more often than not, if you've structured your application as multiple components within a page, you're going to be dealing with multiple components within your tests to get a true user perspective. So it doesn't always make sense to mimic that structure. However, if you felt when you kind of go to indoctrinate this in that the features, steps and pages structure that we have doesn't work for you, just be mindful of having something that's a bit more inclusive of being supportive for multiple components. The next thing I want to call your attention to, which came out partially from a discussion with some other people in LJC, funnily enough, is about looking out for technical jargon within those feature files. So behavior-driven development does advocate that you should be forming those examples in collaboration with key stakeholders. But from speaking to people and from my own experiences, I'm fully aware that sometimes that's not always possible. It's not always practical for various different reasons. It might be people are busy. It might be that, you know, you have an external facing user and therefore you're going through a product manager. There's loads of different reasons. And what I see happen quite a lot is that technologists with best intentions will go and adapt the behavioral specifications as part of their testing, either in back-end integration tests or in these end-to-end tests. And what will end up happening is rather than mimic the user workflow, they will mimic the structure of the system. And that should be a big warning flag. So whenever you're looking at your features or you're pulling in behavior-driven development practices, be on the lookout for technical jargon because it shouldn't be there. So for example, I see normally things like, given I make this particular service call, or given the database has the following data, things that refer to infrastructure specifically are normally a bad indicator. Another indicator that might show you that we're focusing on it in more of a kind of feature-based approach rather than a user workflow comprising of multiple operations would be to look for situations where there's a lot of copy-paste across scenarios. So if you're using the same given and when steps and then just changing then quite a lot, it might be that you can potentially combine these together to form a better and more inclusive scenario. So be on the lookout for that too. The next thing I want to call your attention to is reporting, which might sound a bit odd, because you'll be thinking, well, why would I want to show my test results to my users? I think exposing them in user-friendly reporting can help you basically validate and prove that your system is working with the intended behavior. And all end-to-end frameworks and behavior-driven development framework tools that you'll find out there for all technologies normally have several sets of plugins available that will expose some quite nice, pretty reporting. But in addition, there's also other things that you can use within Protractor and Cypress themselves for doing things like capturing screenshots or even recording animated GIFs to show the test execution, which I think is pretty cool. And those things are powerful, not just because of that validation argument, but I can see the potential for those artifacts being used in other ways. You could use them for, you know, providing assistance with user training, documentation for user guides, also potentially, if you're smart, production verification maybe for a subset of tests. There's loads of different ways to use those reports and those results of your tests. So just be mindful of that when you go to indoctrinate it into your process too. This is a very timely one. We're having this problem at the moment. Try and integrate it into your continuous integration pipeline as quickly as you can, which is something that we did not do. So what happened with us was we had, for the purposes of the proof of concept, we had a custom job in our pipeline that was not part of the dedicated deployment pipeline. It was segregated, it was all on its own. And that came to be a problem for several reasons. Firstly, it wasn't actually being used as a verification to assert that a non-production environment had broken when we flipped the front end. So that proved to be issue number one. You would find that out normally when you ran the job afterwards. So, you know, it's not really helpful in terms of eliminating manual effort. The other problem it had was if people had changed the view, which will break these tests if you've changed your structure, especially with the page object pattern, or potentially you've not put in, you've put in the new feature into any of the workflow scenarios. That wasn't getting picked up until really far down the pipeline. So what we're doing to try and fix this at the moment is two things. We are looking to try and use these tests as some sort of verification for deployment to a non-production environment. But the other thing we're looking at is trying to indoctrinate it a bit earlier into our peer review process. So whenever we raise a pull request, can it run these automatically and then inform the reviewer to make sure that they know that the tests are running and working as expected. And then the final item, which I will hold my hands up, might seem to be a little bit controversial, but also related to that aforementioned continuous integration point, is have a think about, does it make sense to mock versus to ping your service directly. This comes back to one of those points I made earlier about this idea that a lot of people think that end-to-end testing means that you need to connect every single layer. There's some practical reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. For example, if you are undertaking local development and you are building a brand new or amending a workflow with a new feature, does it make sense to ping a backend service? It might not be there yet. Your colleague might be working on the service calls at the moment. Or if it is there, you're making your test really brittle because local development is dependent on a service further down in the pipeline. And if that environment goes down, you can't build against it. So then you have to go off and fix it, similar to what Steve had to do when things broke in prod when he was on call. So you should have a think about when it makes sense to override with mocks and when it makes sense to ping the direct services. So my thought on this is that for direct service calls, it makes sense further down the line for integration with the services when we get to later on in the pipeline and we're deploying to some source of non-production environment for verification, which is a standard practice in where I work. But whenever I'm doing local development, I think it makes sense to either have a mock service that I'm pinging or to utilize stubs and mocks, which Protractor and Cypress and most likely any other testing framework should be able to provide for you. So just like a coda in music, we're reaching the end of this talk. So I want to summarize some of the key lessons that I've covered today. So first thing I want to highlight is that BDD, behavioural specifications, and end-to-end testing are a good combination because they help you integrate and reinforce the user perspective of workflow in front-end tests. We've discussed some of the best practices and lessons that I've had, particularly around things like integration with, continuous integration pipelines and some other items as well. And I've also covered a very brief example. And if anyone wants to dig out afterwards, that's the link there to my personal GitHub, and you can see all the code there if you want to have a dig. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen today about our experiences of combining behavior-driven development and end-to-end testing practices together. I do encourage you to try these out for yourselves if you've not, but also be on the lookout for those other techniques that you think might not mash together, but actually could make something a lot better. So if anyone wants to reach out afterwards, all my handles are listed there. The QR code for the repository is there too. But right now, if anyone has any questions they want to raise now, I'm more than happy to answer.
That's great. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, does anyone want to unmute yourself and ask a question? I think we have one in the chat. So I'm going to read it for you. Okay, Carly?
Yeah.
At what point in the development cycle do you write the behavioral scenarios? Before or after writing the code for a feature? And how long would it take on average to write up a scenario? And does it risk development time?
Those are some really good questions. Hold on a minute. I'm going to try and see if I can get the chat thing up.
Okay. Yeah, because there is more than one question in one.
Whoa. Okay, that's good. Okay, here we go. I can see the chat now that I've pulled this away. Okay, cool. Right. So at what point in the development cycle do you write these behavioral scenarios? If you want to reach out to me afterwards, I can send some stuff on from Sebros. But basically, for behavioral scenarios should be part of kind of any discovery that you're going to be doing. So normally you'd expect that these are upfront, and that's what we've normally been doing in some of the projects I've worked on in prior years. The examples would be specified upfront before you start writing code. And if you can get that done, it's not easy. There are loads of practical challenges with it. It can be helpful because it helps you enforce a test-driven development approach against that particular example because it's already going to be there. It means you're less likely to fall into that trap that I talked about with the technical jargon because you've not written it yet. And the other advantage that you can have as well of trying to do it up front is that it can inform part of any kind of planning and design discussions that you have, because you've got documented proof of how the user perspective is going to work, and that can help you inform the architecture, both in terms of the front end and the component-based design, but also potentially connections to any back-end services or any other infrastructure that you have. How long does it take to write up a scenario? How long is a piece of string? Normally, I found that it doesn't really take long, because normally, because it's in that English-like language, if you get the opportunity to sit with someone that is going to be using the system, or a product manager who has that particular mindset, you can normally get the scenarios covered very quickly for the base case, i.e. how you expect everything to work. So that could be depending on the complexity of it, and also the data constraints. Obviously, if you've got a large data set, that can mean it takes a lot longer with those data tables. It can probably take a few minutes maybe to do a simple one, and then obviously it gets longer as it's more complicated. But then you might find, as you look at it, especially from a front end viewpoint, you might need to consider validations. You know, is there particular error scenarios that a user might try and, you know, do something different, and therefore how does that impact? So it should be hopefully quite quick. And I find it quite useful to write them up front as well, because it helps me with potentially kind of layout of the screen and things, and I can get to think about all those other attributes as well. Steve, you asked a question as well. Oh, Tina, I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, reach out to me afterwards. I'm more than happy to have a chat in detail if that would help. Steve, you asked about running the same tests against all environments, or do you have different suites used at different times? So at the moment, we have all tests running against all environments, which is one of the reasons why we can't use it as production verification, because you can't inject data into production. That's not a good idea. And that's why I think with the mocks thing as well, you need to have an element of practicality. So one thing we want to look at further down the line, probably once we've sorted out the pipeline issues that I talked about, one thing I'd like to do is basically say, for maybe some basic ones, some basic workflow operations, could I potentially run it against production in a mock mode, in which case you need to specify which ones are suitable for which environment. Happy to keep you posted if we ever get there. But I think it's a fair point when you're thinking about the environment, especially when you're pinging back-end dedicated infrastructure, you need to have a think about which tests it makes sense to run for a verification, particularly in production, and which ones are not. So it might be that clicking the buttons might be fine, as long as you can do a clear down of any kind of persisted data. But starting to inject data in is not going to be a good idea. You might end up with some interesting results. It's a question from Fabio as well. Do you suggest to create end-to-end scenarios that involve both back-end and front-end, TypeScript and front-end, and Java on the back-end, in the same feature files, or do you suggest not missing steps with different languages? It's a really good question, and actually your infrastructure in terms of your front-end and back-end is the same as ours. In an ideal world, I would like them to be the same, but I get that, particularly if you're using behavioral specifications for the Java backend side of things, it's probably more, a lot of those ones I see are more focused on logic, particularly for us working in financial systems. It's normally like big tables of data showing the transformation of data. Meanwhile, the front end ones, there's a lot more workflow focused elements, although there is some element of data in there for showing on the grid. It's definitely less so. My thought, which I'd be keen to hear anyone's thoughts on, would be to try and have a subset that are common, particularly around data, because I don't see how the one for calculation should be the same for showing the data. As long as the data is there, I think you should be able to utilize that same feature scenario in both sides, and then just write the particular steps code that is language specific. I'm not sure how you would get around writing the steps, you know, to be agnostic, unless you were using the same, you were using JavaScript for everything, for example, if you had a node service. So that's probably what I'd say on the steps thing as well. But obviously, if you have different experiences, more than happy to chat on that too.
Thank you, Carly. There are two more questions that I think you skipped them.
I probably did. I apologize. What are the other alternatives to Protractor that you know about, and how do you like them? Steve, I might pull you in. So Luis, we're using Protractor, but I'm starting to wonder about converting to Cypress for various reasons. Partially because Protractor does seem to be going out of favor a little bit in comparison to Cypress from speaking to people. So, and I think as well from Cypress, from what I've seen, it has quite a nice clean syntax. It doesn't use that page object pattern from what I've seen in terms of reading. But what it does have is it does things like, you know, element.get, visit, those kinds of things, which is a nice clean syntax. But Steve, I guess, do you want to say a bit about your usage of Cypress? Because you're the expert here. I'm kind of learning from you right now.
I nearly wore my Cypress t-shirt today, but I decided I shouldn't write any unrelated tools. Yeah, but I'm a massive fan of Cypress, partially for the reasons that Carly said, but more what she alluded to in her talk, which was around recording. So Cypress has got some really good tools for playing back your test failures. It won't just come up with like fail to get this at this point, and you're like, well, what does that even mean? And have to rerun it locally. Instead, we use a tool called Cypress Dashboard, where all of our test recordings are automatically pinged over to something on Cypress's side, where we can like watch the video of it actually playing back in our CI pipeline, and we can see exactly where it broke and why.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool. And then Mark had one. Do's and don'ts to make tests maintainable. Oh wow, I could probably do a talk on just that. I'm just gonna say I'm the end. Like I was doing there's a couple of colleagues I see on the call, and we were doing like a mob review this morning, and I had to make it clear that I am probably one of the most opinionated reviewers that we have in the team. For me, in terms of making tests maintainable, I think obviously the ideal situation, which doesn't always work, is try to keep them as short as possible. Especially with specification, the feature files. One thing I notice a lot, which is starting to become a bit of an issue, is that if you look at each individual feature as being a brand new thing with a new scenario rather than integrating as part of a workflow, you can get to this situation where you have a bit of feature file explosion. And although you might be reusing some step code in the background, what you'll end up finding is that you end up with these very disjointed end-to-end tests. So my kind of thought that we're looking at the moment is whenever we were reviewing things this morning, we were looking at the feature and trying to figure out if it belonged in an existing scenario as kind of the preference before you start writing a new one. So that's another thing I'd point out. Reuse things as much as possible. So try and do reusable steps as much as you can. Again, the folder structure thing is definitely still relevant. Have a think about as well, you know, that kind of age-old, this applies to unit tests as well, but should you be having, you know, your data set as part of the setup for each individual scenario, or does it make sense to reuse some test data? That can be a big help as well, because then you won't have the copy paste of data all the way through, which sometimes that does make sense for readability of a test, but sometimes it doesn't. I'm sure there are loads of other things. I'm sure, Mark, you've got a few as well. I think the final thing I'd talk about is try and talk about the scenarios and try and pull in that user or that stakeholder if you can, just because it will help you with building the understanding of how the product's intended to work. And that as a front-end developer is such a powerful thing.
Right. Do you still have time, Carly? Because we have 2 questions yet. I can stay in the meeting if you have time to answer them.
I can answer them very quickly. So I see one from, thanks, Brooke.
Brooke, yeah.
I know Brooke. Do you write all of your end-to-end tests using BDD, or are there some that you write directly? PS, Cypress is great. Thank you, Brooke. I will be annoying you later. unfortunately, we're writing them directly. And this is exactly why I was pulling together, one of the reasons I was pulling together this talk as well, because arguably if you're doing things such as maybe refinement, or you've got direct access to users, you should be sitting talking to them. Quite often we go with a mock-up first and then we talk about it, but arguably that's the point when we should be also documenting that at the same time. So I'm going to hold up my hands and say right now we are not. It's being done directly as part of the dev process, but we're going to try and change that and hopefully pull them a bit earlier. Do I have a view on imperative steps versus the page object declarative steps? So Stephen, I'm assuming you're meaning like the Cypress way of doing things, where it's more of, very descriptive of what you're doing, versus the Protractor page object way, where you are, talking about the elements that you're pulling out. So from what I've kind of seen in research and things, I like the way that the page object pattern works in terms of it abstracts your view out from your test. That is a nice thing. But I think the way that that's structured, because you're thinking about it in terms of getting an element on the page, I think that can lead to brittleness in your tests. And if you start changing the appearance of your model, or your view rather, you end up breaking things very easily. So I can see a brittleness to it. I haven't used Cypress enough to say if I think that expressive language, is 100% better, but from my reading, it definitely feels that way. It does feel like it captures the user perspective a lot better, in my opinion. And I guess Steve, obviously, I think you kind of alluded to that in a prior answer as well. So I think probably I'd prefer, obviously don't want to commit, I'm still using Protractor right now, but I'd probably commit to having something that's a bit more, descriptive of the function there instead of the page object pattern, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Carly, I'm impressed. Lots of good questions here. I think you weren't expecting that many.
No.
So yeah, we are out of time now, but I wanted to, before we finish here, I wanted to thank you very much to Steve and Carly for your talk and for sharing your knowledge, and of course for everyone who joined and asked questions and were here with us today. So thank you very much, everyone. And that's all for today. See you on our next meetings.
Well, thank you, everyone.